Hello all, and welcome to today's webinar on managing environmental compliance during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Kayla Martins, and I am the manager of the Retail Compliance Center. Today, I will be helping to guide our conversation and moderate. Before I introduce our speakers for today, I have a couple housekeeping notes. Next slide. This presentation is provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, financial, or other professional advice. In addition, this presentation does not purport to be all-inclusive or contain all the information that be required. The Retail Compliance Center prohibits both the copying and redistribution of this presentation without written consent of the Retail Compliance Center. Next slide. Jumping right into our antitrust statement, which may or may not apply to this situation, but please avoid any discussion of prices, pricing policies, terms of or conditions of doing business, or of course any sort of market allocation. Also to be avoided is any discussion that may be perceived as suggesting that anyone should cease doing business with a particular supplier or customer, or any other discussion that might be viewed as coercive or exclusionary toward another company. If anyone feels uncomfortable about any subject of discussion or has any questions, please let us know and we will stop the conversation until we can provide legal guidance. Other housekeeping notes here before I introduce our speakers. You have noticed that your phones are muted during the webinar. They will stay that way throughout the entire webinar. This is to avoid any noise or background issues. If you have any questions that come up that you'd like to ask myself or the speakers, or there are any comments or concerns, please use the Q&A box that is within your Zoom window to ask questions. We will have some time at the end to go through those and answer those. So please place those there. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce our three presenters for today. We first have Angela Levin with Troutman Sanders LLP. Angela is a partner in the San Francisco office of Troutman Sanders LLP and a member of the firm's Environmental and Natural Resources section. Pat Perry and John Storlie are consultants that specialize in environmental compliance for retailers. We're so happy to have them today. Pat Perry works with Oak Creek Associates and John Storlie works with Retail Environmental Solutions. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Angela.
Thanks so much, Kayla, and I'm excited to be with everybody today. I think what we want to do during our discussion is give a high-level overview of the federal and state guidance that has been issued regarding environmental compliance under our current conditions with COVID-19. And I'll be doing that. And then I'm going to kick it to Pat and to John to walk through some of the RCC compliance resources and some of the actual application of these guidance and specific examples of how these different programs that apply to retail are playing out in practice. And then I think at the end, we're going to leave some time for conversation and for some Q&A to just really have an open dialogue about how this is working in practice and some best practices and ways to move forward. Kayla, can you go to the next slide? So as I'm sure all of you know, on March 26th, the EPA issued an enforcement discretion policy that applies during COVID-19 and really walks through the federal agency's understanding and how it intends to apply environmental laws under these very extreme circumstances. Just to point out that even though it was issued on March 26th, that actually applies retroactively to March 13th. And by its terms, it applies to really routine compliance obligations, monitoring, sampling, training, the types of things that are going to be most impacted by the resource constraints, by the social distancing measures that have been put into place by many states in order to limit the spread of the virus. Under the policy, it is really an enforcement discretion policy where EPA is going to relieve the imposition of penalties for these types of routine compliance requirements if they're not met, if EPA decides that COVID-19 was the cause of the non-compliance. And what that means is in practice, you know, that the company is going to need to provide documentation and a demonstration that any lapses in environmental compliance are caused by COVID-19 and not some other cause. You know, one of the things in particular that we're going to be focusing on today is hazardous waste generation and how COVID-19 is affecting the ability to get waste off-site and to maintain generator status. And at least, and EPA speaks directly to this in the enforcement discretion memorandum, talking about the fact that not only is there no effect on generator status for very small or small quantity generators if the program is implemented by EPA, but also if you're not able to have your waste picked up on time, then it doesn't transfer, you know, doesn't create a new status for your facility as a storage facility, a TSD. So instead, you get to maintain your generator status. Next slide, please. Now, it has more limited applicability to really what you would consider more substantive noncompliance. If you have any emissions exceedances, if you have an air permit, or if you have actual releases to the environment, you know, those are not the kind of things that are really directly contemplated by the enforcement discretion policy. And part of that is due to the overlapping and intersection with state agencies and local agencies and enforcement of these types of programs and these types of exceedances. So EPA, you know, promises to work with states and tribes where applicable to navigate those types of exceedances, but it's a more limited applicability to those types of issues. The last thing substantively about the policy that I want to point out, because I know this has been a question that I've heard from a lot of folks about, you know, what are we seeing on the inspection front? Are inspections continuing, and how is that playing out right now, given the fact that governments are also subject to social distancing and the other limitations put in place by shelter-in-place orders? And EPA speaks directly to this, although of course it is not in control of local and state inspections. It encourages states to take into account, you know, COVID-19, and that EPA will be taking that into account in its evaluation of state and local enforcement programs and their reviews, their periodic reviews that they have to do pursuant to some of those programs. But at the end of the day, and as I think you'll see for the rest of this discussion, you know, this policy does not affect, explicitly does not affect state or local programs that are implemented by states or local and state enforcement. And it can't, right, through our federalism concepts of environmental laws. So, you know, what that means in practice is that it's nice to have this federal policy to point to, but on a day-to-day level, a lot more important is what your state is saying. And so with that, Kayla, could you move to the next slide? So what are states saying? There has been, as I'm sure all of you have seen, significant criticism of EPA's policy, both by environmental groups and a number of states, with many of the states listed submitting letters to EPA criticizing the policy and reinforcing, you know, that many states consider environmental compliance to be essential during this time, and not to contemplate, you know, this broad-based exemption. And for example, you know, California is always a good one to look to. Recently, Cal EPA issued a statement with that quote. You know, they're going to continue to respond and investigate and take action. And in particular, that Cal EPA will fill any enforcement gaps left by EPA's decision to reduce oversight. And I think, you know, I know that with the broader environment, with the broader tension between states and the federal government on environmental programs right now, I think a lot of folks, a lot of states are skeptical of EPA's enforcement discretion policy. But I think, you know, it does still require a significant amount of documentation and justification. You know, it's not just a free pass, even at the federal level, but you see that at the state level, they're even asking for more. So Cal EPA says, you know, clearly articulated circumstances, and more importantly, going to require pre-approval of non-compliance or an extension of a deadline. And that, I think, is much trickier, so that you're not just after the fact demonstrating that you're going to need that pre-approval and that coordination with the agency. You see there's a link at the bottom of this slide, sorry, before we go on there, that links to some RELA resources on state level status of how they're applying environmental compliance requirements during COVID-19, which is a great resource. With that, I'm going to kick it to, I think, Pat, to take it from here.
So the Retail Compliance Center is tracking is tracking state pandemic guidance. And as you'll see here, there's a list of resources that are available right now can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So I'm not sure where you left off. I was just mentioning that California has one of the strictest bottles and can recycling laws. And not surprisingly, we haven't seen any guidance out of that state regarding recycling there. So, you know, if your company is contemplating, we're recommending that you take a look at the resources on the link provided here. If you don't see the state that you're interested, do some research to see if the state has maybe published a notice and you haven't caught it here. And I would ask that if you do find something, if you could forward it to Kayla at the RCC so then she can update the online resource, that would be great. And then, you know, once you have a sense of state guidance or lack thereof, right, you need to really weigh the options and balance the risks based on what makes sense for your company's operations and concerns at your location. So the link that's provided here will take you to more detailed information gathered by RCC and including links directly to the state websites. So let's move on and talk about consumer bags. Kind of the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so in a minute, we will pose a polling question to survey you on your company and use of reusable bags during the pandemic. For that, you know, again, you know, some states and many more local jurisdictions have bag regulations that may prohibit the use of, you know, single-use plastic bags, or they require a fee on each bag given to a customer. So in many ways, though, the pandemic has kind of flipped public perception around plastic versus reusable bags. So let's take a quick poll to see how your company is dealing with reusable bags. Okay, all right, so that's kind of interesting. I see, you know, there's a, you know, pretty good number that you know, they're prohibiting the use of single-use bags. So, I mean, what we're seeing, right, from state guidance that's been issued is either states are, you know, out and out banning consumer-provided reusable bags, or they're prohibiting retailers from requiring store employees from packing the bags to, and I noticed just recently, California, as of March 30th, now they're saying that supermarkets can provide a single-use plastic bag without charging the fee that would normally be applicable. So from a practical perspective, you know, it's the safety of retail workers and customers that really appears to be driving what retailers are doing, right, with their bag policies during the pandemic. And I know personally that I've been in store, you know, since early March that have not wanted, you know, customers to bring in and use their reusable bags, but rather use the plastic or paper bags provided. So,
Pat,
okay.
hey, Pat, looking at state responses on bottled bottles and bags so far to date, have you seen any common threads?
Well, I think where we have seen either, state guidance or actions, it's all around, actions to reduce the spread of the virus. So it's nice when states provide information regarding, enforcement and direction, and, it's the states that are silent that tend to cause us pause, right? And raise that question, will I be enforced on?
Okay, so if you were still an EHS director at a retailer, would you reach out to one of the agencies that has not issued guidance to see what their thoughts are on enforcing bottle laws and bag laws?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably have a consultant or outside counsel, ask those questions to keep the company off the radar. But then, take the information as it comes back and really make the best decision for the company based on over here, which is keeping the virus out of the store and protecting employees and customers. So I think at the end of the day, each company is really making their own decision and they're balancing, the risk of their actions. So, I don't know, with that, maybe John, I'll turn it over to you and you can talk about disinfectant products.
Thanks, Pat. The next slide, please. Thank you. We thought it was important to cover this topic because many disinfectant products are highly corrosive, either strong acids or bases, or highly flammable like alcohol-based hand sanitizers. And if they're not used following manufacturer's directions, these products can be dangerous to human health and the environment. In a minute, we'll ask another survey question about new cleaning products in stores. So over the next 2 slides, I'll talk about considerations for new products brought into stores, either as a new SKU for resale to consumers or for in-store use. And we'll also touch on cleaning contractors, your service providers working in your stores. But first, this slide provides 2 links that will help you through these issues, as well as review the US EPA's List N of approved disinfectant products. Kevin, would you please bring up the live polling question on new cleaning products? Well, that's interesting. Kind of what we expected. Definitely some more disinfectants for in-store use and some for new SKUs for resale. So let's jump to the next slide, please.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Maybe before you start, could you just talk a little bit, I keep hearing the term sanitizer and disinfectant, and I hear them used interchangeably. I'm just kind of curious, is there a difference, and do you care if there's a distance or difference between the 2 terms?
I think the short answer is yes. According to the CDC, cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfectants are all part of a broad approach to preventing infectious diseases, but there are differences. Cleaning uses soap or detergent and water to physically remove germs and dirt from surfaces. Sanitizing lowers the number of germs on a surface to a safe level as judged by public health standards. But keep in mind, so far, there's no such safe level that's been broadly agreed upon or defined by public health officials. Lastly, disinfecting kills germs on surface or objects using strong chemicals. So retailers, thinking about those 3 range of products, retailers need to be careful about cleaning products and the federal FIFRA law. FIFRA requires EPA registration for any substance intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest, including germs. So the key concept here is that products that sanitize, disinfect, or sterilize require registration under FIFRA, while mere cleaners do not. Now, the EPA has a whole web page on this topic, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Generally, the FIFRA registration process would fall to the manufacturer, But where retailers have gotten into trouble is when selling cleaners on their websites and the web copy or the copy on that SKU overstates the sanitizing or disinfecting properties of a cleaner and pulls that cleaning product under FIFA regulation.
Got it. Hey, just one last thing. Where can I find EPA's list of approved cleaning chemicals?
Well, the EPA's N list provides a comprehensive list of disinfectant products approved by the agency, and you can find it on their website. But the Retail Compliance Center has a link to a nice site that provides the SKU for each approved disinfectant and also the corresponding SDS. Jumping back to the slide, whether new products are brought into a store for sale or to help with extra cleaning efforts, there are environmental and OSHA hazard communication standards to consider, as well as operational implications. So think general awareness training. At a minimum, employees need to know there are hazards with any chemicals they could be using in the workplace, and they also need to know where to get the information on them from the SDS. Now, as I mentioned, these products can be strong acids or bases or even flammable, and some might even meet the definition of a hazardous waste, particularly in stringent states. A waste determination should be performed on new products to provide direction to the stores for proper disposal at the store level. So whether you're working with whether you're working with a new cleaning contractor, an existing contractor, or a combination of both as a service provider, COVID-19 poses a whole set of unique conditions to be understood around disinfecting stores. Now, these contractors are your partners in helping to keep the employees and the customers safe, yet it's prudent to ask them how their employees are trained, what disinfectant cleaning chemicals they will be using, will there be changes from their normal SOP because of the COVID-19 response, and how will the cleaning materials that they bring onto your property, along with residual cleaning chemicals and containers, be handled and managed? Well, it's the contractor's responsibility to ensure their employees are properly trained. They are working on your premises and potentially exposing your employees and customers to your company and your company to liabilities.
John, can you maybe summarize what Pat was indicating there?
Yes, thanks, Kayla. I think Pat was reminding us to make sure that your SDSs are current, that you have a mechanism to get them available to the store employees, and that they know how to access and read the information on an SDS. It should be part of their normal onboarding training. And so if you have a turnover related to the COVID-19 and new employees coming on, it's important that we're doing the HAZCOM training and making sure that your library of SDSs is current with new products being brought into the stores. It doesn't seem that OSHA's giving, yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm back. I don't know, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead then, Pat.
Oh, okay. No, I was just going to, I wanted to ask you another question, because when you were speaking, it just made me think about secondary containers. Can you maybe talk a little bit about those requirements?
Sure. Secondary containers is an important consideration, Pat. Thanks for bringing that up. A secondary container, as it applies to the hazard communication standards, is any container holding a product which is not the original container supplied by the manufacturer with that original information. A spray bottle, for example, with diluted product. There are two mandatory pieces of information which needs to be included on the secondary container labels. One is the identity of the hazardous chemicals in the product, and two, the hazards, whether they're physical, health-related, or environmental. And that is one of the most common violations, OSHA violations cited.
Right, right. Hey, and then just one last thing. So if you're using all the disinfectant product, how could there be a potential for hazardous waste to be generated?
Well, accidents and spills happen. Customers return open items. There are residuals in the containers. Are your store employees getting containers truly RCRA empty? Take hand sanitizer, for example. Hand sanitizer is flammable, a federal hazardous waste. So before you can throw that empty container in the regular trash or recycling, it would have to be RCRA empty, or empty by commonly used practices. So what does that mean? Tell the stores they need to use it all up, empty that container. Now in California, it's hard to meet the California empty standard for viscous products like some hand sanitizers. So the conservative approach there is to put the empty container in your hazardous waste program in stores in California. And finally, employees need to know how to safely clean up spills and how to properly dispose of spill cleanup materials. Let's take a little deeper dive into the topic of hazardous waste. Next slide, please. The link on this slide takes you to a set of FAQs Pat and I prepared early when the COVID-19 related issues were first starting to affect retail. By now, many of you have probably already explored these topics and had these discussions internally and with your vendors. The FAQs provide suggestions like talking to your waste hauler about their pandemic business continuity plans, preparing your hazardous waste accumulation areas for temporary store closures, postponing pickups, and other topics. In the next slide, we'll be asking a live polling question on working with waste haulers. So we have a few more slides to walk through, and then Angela, Pat, and I will have a conversation around the topics. And we hope that you are sharing your questions via by means of the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. Vendor business continuity. Would you pull up the live polling question on waste haul or service disruptions, please? Well, that's interesting, and that's what we've seen too. Is with our clients is no disruptions or very few and very manageable set of disruptions. But who knows what tomorrow will bring, right? There could be more staff shortages as this virus rolls out further across the country. So typically we think of business continuity planning in terms of our own businesses, and COVID-19 has raised the importance of understanding your vendor business partner continuity plans as well. It's important to know how prepared they are to deal with the challenges presented by the virus. Regular communication with your waste vendor, for example, is always the best way to stay updated. And if you haven't already, you should have a specific conversation with them around the pandemic and their business continuity. You might ask questions like, how will service events be triaged and prioritized in the event of technician or driver illness? What happens if a TSDF facility closes? Are there alternatives available? And what provisions are being taken by the waste haulers technicians to guard against spreading the virus when they're in your stores? Not that those issues will necessarily come up, but it's important to think about them and anticipate that potentiality. You want to think about what information you need to keep track of and how you get that information from your waste vendor. A store's generator status will dictate much of what you need to do. And so, for instance, if your locations tend to be very small quantity generators, it might not be a big concern, but certainly LQGs and SQG locations have time-sensitive data points and obligations to be monitored. As the generator, you are responsible for your own compliance, even when you are relying on a vendor's turnkey service. Finally, don't forget to communicate to your waste vendor any changes in store hours that may restrict their service window. Likewise, we don't want to forget to tell them when stores close temporarily. Next slide, please. When temporarily closing a location due to COVID-19 concerns, many of the decisions you make will be based on or triggered by generator status. Certainly, LQGs and SQGs have more factors to be considered than very small quantity generators. Layer the generator status over various state regulations, and you can see the situation can get very complicated. Consider developing an internal checklist or other communication that will help ensure consistency of actions across multiple locations, across multiple jurisdictions. Perform and document inspection of the hazardous waste accumulation areas. This will help you demonstrate good faith compliance efforts later down the road if there's an after the fact question or inspection. Whether you decide to ship accumulated hazardous waste prior to shutdown of operations at a particular location, or to leave that waste on site, a written communication will help your store employees understand and know what's expected of them during this time of unprecedented actions. Next slide, please. You might postpone or cancel a pickup because of the hauler's limitations, or it may be driven by your needs. For example, a retailer recently had to close and deep clean a store for a couple of days because a service vendor employee had been in the store and tested positive the next day. To minimize that happening, now that retailer is evaluating the necessity and frequency of all service provider visits. When you're faced with canceling or postponing service events, you're going to need to research if any enforcement waivers or guidance has been issued for the different service areas and jurisdictions. As Angela's presentation made clear, there's a wide range of state expectations on compliance and enforcement. Work with your waste vendor to triage or prioritize service events and ensure that your expectation and needs are being met. So the link on this slide about medical waste takes you to a set of FAQs prepared by Wade Scheel of Clean Earth, formerly Stericycle. The FAQ describes the distinctions between regulated medical waste and waste from general decontamination or cleaning of workplaces. Among other things, it notes that OSHA does not have any special requirements for waste that may be contaminated with COVID-19, and that used PPE, cleanup rags, and wipes with non-hazardous disinfectant can be managed as regular solid waste, provided it's not from a lab or clinical setting and does not include sharps. Now, the same would apply to customer PPE, gloves and masks that customers might leave in your store waste containers. It's a really good FAQ, and I encourage you to take a look at it and all the information there. Now, your employees still need to take care in handling waste that may be contaminated with the virus, but they don't need to manage that material as a special or medical or a biohazard waste. As I said, I encourage you to read Wade's FAQ. Next slide, please. Well, we focused much of this presentation around hazardous waste and some recycling and other regulations. But we can't forget that many retailers operate other facilities other than retail, such as distribution centers, corporate headquarters, cross docks, even manufacturing plants. And those are often have other environmental regulations. We knew there wouldn't be time to delve into much more than just hazardous waste in this webinar. However, we do want to call attention that there are common themes that exist across all the programs, including the requirements around inspections, monitoring, maintenance, training, record keeping, reporting. The EPA and the states are not just giving a free pass without documenting solid reasons for why compliance obligations can't be met. And sometimes some are requiring that justification in advance. So think about the potential consequences. For example, what if there's a major leak from a system like a UST or an ammonia refrigeration system and it goes undetected? Can you avoid the consequence by planning for that? Or or doing some backup planning or reviewing the backup and contingency plans that are already in place? Are the designated personnel still there? Are the plans current? Are the designated people in place, or are there replacements in place that are familiar with and competent to perform the response actions and to keep up with the inspections that would prevent an unwanted release? So that is the end of our prepared slides. If we go to the next slide, we hope to take some questions here.
Thank you, John, and thank you to our presenters as well for the great slides and information. We do have some questions coming in, and just as a reminder, if you have any that come up, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom. One thing I wanted to point out really quickly before going to that, on our slide regarding consumer bag regulations, I think we might have mentioned that some information about California and collecting recyclables. And I did have a note from one of our viewers that California actually did suspend the requirement to collect recyclables during COVID-19. So I did want to just point that out. Moving into some questions here. We've had a number of registrants ask questions about whether stores still need to perform regular compliance activities, so inspections, training, waste pickups, record keeping. Is there a free pass on routine compliance during the crisis? Angela, this might be a good question for you to answer first.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. And I think absolutely no, it is not a free pass. It would need to be a very measured and thoughtful and justified pass, quote unquote. You know, even under EPA's policy, you know, there are 4 or 5 elements that you're going to have to meet to demonstrate and justify to the agency that an excuse is warranted of any of your routine compliance obligations. And at the state level, as we've talked about, you're not even going to get that much, depending on the state. Like in California, where if you want some delay or you know, non-compliance to be excused, you're going to need to ask ahead of time. So I would not think of this as a free pass. I would think of it instead as a very heavily documented and justified, based on, you know, specific circumstances that you can demonstrate excuse the non-compliance or the delay in compliance. John, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think Pat and I would completely agree with that. That being said, I think it's hard enough keeping a program with hundreds of facilities in full compliance in normal times. So I think things are going to fall through the cracks, but I wouldn't rely on, you know, expectations of leniency. I think we hope that the agencies will have some discretion, and individual inspectors will have some discretion and leniency afterwards, but I wouldn't plan on it. I wouldn't count on it. I wouldn't make it part of my program. I would definitely expect some sticks in the mud from agencies.
Great, thank you both. Another question that we have, you mentioned earlier in the slides, preparing stores for a temporary shutdown. What actions should stores take to ensure hazardous waste is properly managed during the shutdown?
Well, I think the first thing to do is make sure that you process all the damaged and defective items into the proper waste containers, so that you don't have a cart or tote of damages that could cause an adverse reaction, such as giving off noxious or poisonous fumes or even start a fire. Then make sure that all the waste containers are closed, upright, secure, appropriately labeled. If you're in an earthquake area, make sure that, you know, they're on a stable rack or on the floor. Things are tied up, that lamp boxes are tied so that things aren't going to tip over when the store is vacant. In general, make sure that the hazardous waste accumulation area is organized and secured for the full duration of the temporary shutdown. And then I think it would be a very good practice to do a final inspection of the hazardous waste accumulation area, including your manifests and records. Document that inspection in writing. Just put it in your inspection binder or online record keeping, and have that as good faith record of good faith effort to be in compliance as you close up.
Great, thank you, John. Moving ahead with some questions here. We did have one viewer ask how, and I'm not sure if John or Angela, you can speak to this. The question was, how are companies handling the shift from voluntary use of face coverings to mandatory use? And they added in that, are there any OSHA considerations raised from that? We obviously can't ask some of the people on the phone today, but I didn't know if with your work with retailers, if you could answer that.
I'm not exactly sure what the question is. I'm looking at what they've written here, and I think what they've written is right, is that, you know, you have your own policies, and where states are making requirements requiring masks, you're going to have to follow those policies. And I'm not familiar with new OSHA considerations around wearing the mask, and reusing masks or handling masks. But you do need to train the employees about using the mask properly. I was in a store recently, and the employee was wearing a mask, but it was only over his mouth. It was below his nose. So that doesn't really help. It doesn't protect him, and it doesn't protect the customer. And then, of course, you know, handling the mask, putting your fingers on the active part of the mask instead of just back at the strings or straps, presents some, you know, kind of defeats the purpose of the mask. So just providing masks or gloves without providing training could pose a problem for a store, could pose exposure to a company in terms of violations or liability down the road.
Right, absolutely. Okay. We're continuing with questions on hazardous waste. Question here, does all hazardous waste need to be removed prior to temporary store shutdown? And do we need to worry about accumulation time limits?
Yeah, I think you do need to worry about accumulation time limits unless you can get an extension. Wisconsin, for example, will give a 30-day extension if you ask and justify beforehand. And so then it depends on your generator status, right? If you're an LQG, you still have to ship every 90 days. Some states will allow some more leniency, like Wisconsin. If your facility is a very small quantity generator and you're outside of California or New Hampshire, as long as the accumulation weight is well below 2,200 pounds, you could store, you could leave the waste there at the store during a shutdown and postpone pickup until after reopening.
Okay, thank you, John. Are there any agencies performing inspections during the stay-at-home orders? How are inspections being conducted during the pandemic, and will it interrupt store business?
Well, with our clients, we're seeing a range of responses, and I'm sure the folks on the participants are seeing that as well. Some agencies are still doing their routine inspections. Others are doing, for instance, we're closing a facility with one client, and the agency wants to do a closeout inspection of the hazardous waste area. Others are just have issued guidance saying they're not going to do inspections unless there are complaints. Others are doing virtual inspections or asking for self-inspections. Pat had a client where the regulator sent them a list of questions and asked for photographs and to send in the paper records, the manifests and training records and so forth. You know, and I think that's a good compromise. I would take that seriously. Be careful that, you know, as you respond, in a sense, you're certifying that these are the actual conditions. So we're seeing a range of responses, you know, virtual inspections that are somewhat more live. We've heard talk of that. I don't know how that actually is working. You can see the technical difficulties we've just had doing this virtual webinar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Quick question that we got here on providing results of polling a question. So this is a good segue to this content. We will send out a recording of the slide to the registrants today, and that will include in it the poll results. And then you will have access to the slides as well, which during Pat and John's times, a lot of the slides have hyperlinks in them. So you'll be able to click on those and go through those links. Our content is also on the Retail Compliance Center site, so you can go directly there. We have a training page where this content will be hosted as well. But again, we will send out a follow-up email with that information. I'm not seeing any more come in at the time. So with that, any other last comments from you, John or Angela?
That's it for me. I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Yeah, same here. On my behalf and Pat's, I thanks for the opportunity to share, and I'm interested in learning if there's feedback from the participants. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, and you know, I know we had some technical difficulties today, and Pat wasn't able to join us all the way through, but really great content from all of you, and we appreciate you taking the time to present today. Last closing remarks I wanted to make. All of this information, as I mentioned earlier, can be accessed on the RCC's website. We will be sending a follow-up email as well as a survey. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe and well.